What's an NSFW fact about history that we don't get to hear too often? When Jadwiga, the king of Poland, medieval Poland referred to every ruler as king regardless of gender, was considering a marriage proposal from the Grand Duke of Lithuania, a chief concern among her court was that said duke was rumored to have massive genitals to the point that they would kill his wife on their wedding night. Two of her counselors volunteered to travel to Lithuania to try and discover the truth of these rumors, which naturally meant they would watch the duke as he bathed. They returned and happily reported that not only weren't the duke's genitals fatally large, they were in fact a tad smaller than average, so nothing to worry about. Thus Poland and Lithuania were united, and the rest is history. The book itself is a novel, but the historical events described therein are accurate based on his research as far as I'm aware. The author of Frankenstein lost her virginity on top of her mum's grave. During wartime some armies would wipe shit on their spears so that when they stabbed/slashed enemies they'd get that extra poison damage. In ancient Egypt they held a fertility festival each year, and at this festival it was the pharaoh's responsibility to strip down and jerk off into the Nile. In ancient Greece, many city-states had these landmark/mile marking/good luck statues called hermae, which consisted of a bust of a god's head and, for some inscrutable reason, an erect phallus at its midsection. In 415 BC, someone mutilated the hermae of Athens in exactly the way you'd expect. Athenians were outraged, initially accusing their enemies, the Spartans, of de-donging the deities, then deducing that it was drunken revelers, before blaming Alcibiades as the knobnabber. Alcibiades was an Athenian statesman and military leader famous for being Socrates' boy lover, as well as having a rather rowdy reputation. He's depicted, in Plato's Socratic works, as being frequently shit-faced and giving, long and rambling, yet very articulate, "I love you, man," speeches. It frankly just seemed like the sort of thing Alcibiades and his bros might do. And he also had a lot of petty political enemies. Alcibiades strenuously denied the accusations of willy whacking, and offered to stand trial immediately to defend himself. Athens, however, decided to wait until after he had left for a military expedition to try him in absentia, condemn him to death, and order him to return home to die. Alcibiades chose instead to defect to Athens' enemy, Sparta. This was during the Peloponnesian War, against Sparta, and right on the eve of the Sicilian expedition, which Alcibiades had planned. Unsurprisingly, the expedition was an unmitigated disaster for Athens, and arguably led to their defeat in the war. Alcibiades, on the other hand, served Sparta for a time, only to defect to Persia after he had been caught sleeping with the king's wife, and then, years later, convinced Athens to take him back and clear him of any charges. TLDR, some rock cockknockers led to Athens' defeat. When Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, was taken from Sion Abbey to the Tower of London to prepare for her execution, she sailed in a barge down the River Thames. She passed under London Bridge, where the severed heads of her alleged lovers Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were waiting for her, displayed on spikes, rotting and picked at by birds. All the documentaries you see about hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt neatly avoid showing you the fertility rites where the pharaoh's phallus is inseminating the land. The deadliest female serial killer in US history had murdered 35 people with an axe by the time she was 18 years old. Witches were more often mutilated than actually burned. 1984, during the Iraq/Iran War, Iraqi forces had laid hundreds of exposed electrical wires in the Majnoon marshes which they knew the Iranians had to cross. Those wires were all snaked together and connected to large electrical generators. When Iran attempted to cross the marsh with boats, Iraq used just enough concentrated artillery to force the Iran soldiers out of the boats and walk through the marshland. As soon as that happened, the Iraqis fired up their generators and electrocuted thousands of Iranian soldiers in an instant. That's not the worst part. The Iraqis then sent in a road-building detail, and collected all of the Iranian dead, and stacked the bodies like cordwood, 5 corpses high, and 5 across, covering them with lime, and then a bunch of sand. They used the Iranian dead to build a road for their trucks to cross the marshlands. The sheer hatred, madness and precision needed to pull this operation off, as well as carry it through, is just horrific to think about. How about the time that NASA funded a study about dolphin communication that ended with one researcher giving a dolphin that was high on LSD a handjob? King Tut's first wife was his half-sister. But she also may have been his full sister, and even at one point may have been his stepmother. A lot of people banged in the White House on the day of Andrew Jackson's inauguration. Pope Alexander VI might have held orgies where he kept track of men's orgasms while he held the position of pope, and also definitely had an infidelity fetish, especially with women whose wedding he'd officiated. He had 4 kids with one married noblewoman, and at least another 3 to 5 outside of that. Benjamin Franklin had a fart fetish. There are letters that prove this where he writes to a woman about her flatulence. Edgar Allan Poe married his 13-year-old cousin when he was 27. A French president died from a blowjob. Well, he had a heart attack while getting a blowjob. But the way I said it first sounded more funny in my head. You know that one psychologist guy, Freud? Well, one time he was tasked with finding the testicles of an eel, so he got literally hundreds of eels so he could find their balls. Nowadays we know eels have retractable testicles, but Freud didn't know that, so he cut up hundreds of eels looking for their testicles. Mozart was into scat humor, like, a lot. Read about Captain Cook. He discovered Hawaii. They docked offshore right at harvest time. The natives thought they were fertility gods and sent their women in canoes to the ship. The crew had a blast year after year. Until the natives figured out what was happening. Genghis Khan's generals, Geb and Subutai, after defeating the Russians, laid thousands of them bound and stacked like cordwood, and built a platform above where he and his generals feasted. All the while the men below suffocated and were crushed to death. Source: Dan Carlin's excellent The Wrath of the Khan series. This thread is half fun silly things, and half horrible atrocities. What a freaking roller coaster, man. According to records, King Jaijung of the Shilla Kingdom had an 18-inch dick. In ancient Egypt, soldiers proved their battle prowess by presenting the severed penises of their slaughtered enemies. Traditionally, severed hands were presented, but in 1182 BC Libyans and other allies invaded Egypt and were defeated by the army of Ramesses III, and Ramesses suspected that some soldiers were claiming extra credit by presenting the hands of women as well as the male soldiers. So he demanded penises instead. His victory inscriptions mention 12,535 foreskins and hands, and has images of the piles of the body parts at the Medinet Habu mortuary temple. Mozart wrote a piece called, "Lick My Ass." I've read so much about Lyndon B. Johnson's cock on Reddit it's unreal. The CIA once considered sending the Soviets condoms that were large labeled small, to convince them that the US was well endowed. Source: in the 1880s, James Jameson, heir to the vast Jameson Irish whiskey fortune, purchased a 10-year-old African girl just so he could draw her being eaten by cannibals. In 1488 an Italian noblewoman Caterina Sforzariero locked herself in a castle to save herself from her enemies. Her enemies managed to capture her children and threatened to kill Tgem if she wouldn't surrender. She climbed on ramparts, lifted her skirt to expose her female parts and shouted, "Fools! Don't you see that I can make myself more children?" May have already been said, there are thousands of comments, but Pope Alexander VI threw a party that is referred to today as the Joust of Whores. He had a large number of women attend a banquet he was throwing, get naked, and would scramble to pick up chestnuts that the Pope and other people at the party threw at them. This party was followed by Alexander holding a contest to see who could sleep with the most women by the end of the night. During the whole thing his kids were also present. Alexander also liked watching his horses breed and would arrange for upwards of 100 horses put outside his palace so he could watch them for hours. The dildo was created almost 1,500 years before the wheel. There are disputed claims that both Napoleon I and Rasputin's members were, well, dismembered during their respective autopsies and have traveled the world extensively, possibly farther than either men ever did, as well as being shown in multiple occasions to the public. On a similar note, it is well known LBJ had a massive Johnson, and Rasputin's girthy schlong was venerated amongst high-class women of his time. No wonder he's indeed Russia's greatest love machine. Not sure if anyone else mentioned it, but when at a Salvador Dali museum, they mentioned that he had a shit fetish. He was alienated from a lot of the modernist movement and even kicked out of some art society he in. And I'm not talking anal, I'm talking literal 2 girls, 1 cup fecal stuff lol. Grimacing face. What is it that people endlessly warm to in a man who once suggested that the deepest way to demonstrate one's love for another is to eat their excrement? For Dali, such vulgarity was not an occasional slip of a sleazy tongue, but a job description. This is an artist who said he enjoyed hearing of transport disasters, who openly applauded Franco's fascism and frequently congratulated the dictator on his political tortures and assassinations, who once chortled that "sometimes I spit on the portrait of my mother for the sheer pleasure of it." It is speculated that the crotches part of the armor, codpiece, was enlarged, not to make the knights and kings' junk look bigger, but to alleviate the pain caused by syphilis when their genitals made contact with the metal pieces. The Romans would often include bestiality as halftime shows for their gladiator matches with strange animals up to and including swans. Grimacing face. History would be everyone's favorite subject in school if the books focused on the things mentioned in this thread. Not NSFW but James Buchanan, US President, never cohabited with his wife, and after his death several love letters were found that he had written to his assumed lifelong male partner. A Nazi doctor injected blue dye into the eyes of hundreds of Jewish people in an effort to make them Aryan. He blinded many people. I'll be arriving in Paris tomorrow evening. Don't wash. Apparently Napoleon loved smelly pussies. Like loved them. Lyndon B. Johnson was quite a vulgar president. He has been reported to have carried meetings into the restroom if he had to use the restroom during the meeting. He also referred to his Johnson as Jumbo, and you can easily find recordings of him making a phone call to a tailor requesting his pants be made with extra room in the area. Simone de Beauvoir was a French feminist author, professor, and Jean-Paul Sartre's kind of girlfriend. She was fired from her job in 1943 for abuse of minors. She had been seducing her underage female students for them to sleep with her and with Sartre, who had an appetite for virgins, and they wrote to each other making fun of these girls. Zhang Zongchang, a Chinese warlord dubbed by Time as China's basest warlord, was nicknamed Old 86, which referred to either his height, or the length of his penis, which was rumored to be as long as 86 Mexican silver dollars stacked together. He was also a poet. Case in point. You tell me to do this. He tells me to do that. You're all bastards. Go fuck your mother. Poem about Bastards, by Zhang Zongchang. There was also this one time during a famine where he visited a temple, and, instead of praying and offering gifts, slapped the temple's statue and said, "Fuck your sister. How dare you make Shandong's people suffer by not giving us rain," then proceeded to order his artillery to shoot into the sky until it rained. It rained the next day. In colonial America, a guy was arrested and charged because he drew a lewd image of his wife in the snow. Puritans didn't appreciate the art. Ciabatta was invented in 1982. Georgios Karaiskakis, Greek general during the Greek War of Independence, was at one point arrested by the Ottomans and asked to surrender. Karaiskakis was known for swearing a lot. His response was, "I asked my D_K and it told me no, not to surrender." The can-can dance was considered very scandalous and obscene because it required high kicks, and women of that time wore pantalettes which had an open crotch, winky face. Catherine the Great had a lot of phallic furniture. It was believed Edward II of England was murdered by a red-hot poker up his arse. The actual death of Ratcliffe, you know, the oddly proportioned villain from Pocahontas? From the Encyclopedia Virginia. The colonists, led by Captain John Ratcliffe, walked into an ambush. About 33 men, or 2/3 of their number, were killed. The Indians captured Ratcliffe, and their women skinned him alive using mussel shells. Félix IV, the French president in 1899, died in l'Élysée while being with a prostitute. In Pisa on St. Catherine's Day, students would search for and capture the fattest Jew they could find and demand a ransom of his weight in sweets. Source: The Great Mortality, John Kelly. Before the widespread availability of abortion, mothers would often choose between infanticide, poison in the nipple, intentional smothering in bed or burying alive for instance, or abandoning the infant either in the woods or in public. This was generally less to hide indiscretions and more because they already had too many mouths to feed. Abandoning the child was considered to be the more guilt-free option. A mother who left their baby in the woods could comfort herself with the thought that maybe a woodsman found and decided to raise the child for instance, although it almost certainly suffered and died of exposure. They could pretend for the rest of their life that their child was just fine out there somewhere. Men invented cages to go over a sleeping baby to prevent the mother rolling over, and were surprised to learn this didn't help because so few cases were actually accidental. An interesting alternative popped up, which was foundling homes, which first came about in Italy during the Renaissance. This offered a tempting alternative to abandoning a child in nature. This was a home. However, it was an open secret that this option usually meant death. There weren't enough wet nurses to go around, and no formula meant that the death rate of these abandoned infants was above 90%. This was an open secret. Mothers knew the babies placed here would probably die, but it allowed them to ease their own conscience. The amount of babies abandoned per year in one foundling home in one city in Italy was in the thousands per year. Before these homes, it wouldn't be uncommon to find dead infants in trash heaps, on the street, or in a river, and the foundling homes did decrease this, but increased abandonment altogether. Some mothers even began abandoning their infants specifically to be hired into the foundling home as a wet nurse. The pay was too tempting. Keep in mind this was still the case well into the 1800s. The Roman Empire drove extinct a plant that was a natural contraceptive. Its triangular leaves inspired the modern Valentine's Day heart shape. Slave owners in the US had a health official who would lick slaves to see if their health was of good standing. There is a carving on the side of the belfry in Ghent that depicts a man suckling the breast of a woman. The story is that the man was condemned to die unless he could prove his innocence by surviving imprisonment without food for 40 days. He could have visitors during his imprisonment, but they of course were checked for food. His daughter visited him every day. She was a wet nurse. He was let go after 40 days having survived. There was a guy that tried to prove that yellow fever wasn't contagious, and so he would pour the infected vomit into his freshly cut opened wood, pouring it into his eyes, and drinking it. And soaking into a bath of it. And smearing his body with blood, piss, and spit. He was fine because yellow fever isn't spread through direct contact, it's spread through mosquitoes. So he did all that for nothing. His name was Stubbins Firth, look it up. King James, you know, like the Bible, had a gay lover who he was absolutely obsessed with. He gave him multiple promotions in status and had a secret passage that connected their chambers. Shi Pei Pu was a Chinese opera singer turned spy active during the 1960s. He pretended to be a woman for 20 years to seduce a French embassy employee and obtain classified documents. His charade went so far as to fake a pregnancy and purchase a child and pretend it was theirs. He managed to fool everyone, including his lover, for over 2 decades before finally being exposed to the world. NASA tried to teach dolphins English, and during the experiment they not only gave dolphins LSD, but a female scientist jacked off a male dolphin to relieve him so they didn't need to take breaks. Everyone thinks of red hair as a Scottish thing. There was no red hair there until the Vikings invaded and, until it became a dominant local trait. The Japanese soldiers who are sent across Asia used to round up able-bodied Chinese men to shoot and kill in an effort to stop the Chinese from revolting and to prove that they were superior to the Chinese. Most of the people who are killed in the colonies were Chinese, all to prove they were superior. In fact, their methods were so brutal that literal Nazis told them that they were going overkill. The Japanese were not only brutal occupiers when it came to other military-aged men. They would take on, comfort women and pass said women around whole squads of soldiers, and they would perform unthinkable acts on these women. Selim II, an Ottoman sultan, died on December 15, 1574, aged 50, in Royal Palace, Topkapi Palace, while chasing women. He slipped while running and hit his head to the marble floor. Not too NSFW, but a fun story regardless. In ancient Egypt around 570 BC, the situation for the Egyptian Empire is growing more and more grim. The current pharaoh Apries kept on losing important battles to the other expanding kingdoms and empires around Egypt. The population thus grew more and more discontent with his god status and started to lose faith in his ability to reign the country. Slowly but surely a group of usurpers started gathering numbers to eventually overthrow Apries. As an answer to this, he sent one of his best generals, Amasis, to beat down the potential rebellion before it would even break out. However, upon arrival, Amasis was convinced to join the cause of the rebellion. After not having heard back from his general in a while, Apries decided to inquire a bit further and eventually found out that Amasis had crossed him. Furious, he sent out a messenger to retrieve Amasis, who, in the meantime, had been elected the rebellion's leader. When the messenger, Patarbemes, arrived, this scenario played out. When Patarbemes came and summoned Amasis, Amasis, sitting on horseback, raised his leg and farted, telling the messenger to take that back to Apries. He went on to successfully dethrone Apries and became known as the last of the great kings of the late dynasty. Napoleon's penis was sold at an auction house as small shrumpled object. More not school-friendly than NSFW, but we learn the merry legend of Johnny Appleseed, who wandered around planting apple seeds wherever he went so apple trees would grow cause he loved apples so much. In reality, Johnny lived on the frontier and was pretty good about knowing where future settlements would crop up further west down the Ohio. He'd get there ahead of time, plant apple seeds to start a nursery of apple trees, fence it in and come back and tend it now and then. When people showed up, he would hire one of them to watch and tend the orchard for him and sell the apple trees to new settlers, stopping by occasionally to make sure everything was okay and get his cut of the money. The big thing they don't tell you in school is that apples that come from trees grown from seeds don't taste good. If an apple tree produces apples that taste good, at least back then, you grafted a piece of the tree into the ground to clone a new tree, not plant its seeds. So Johnny's usually probably tasted like shit. That didn't matter, however, because mostly what settlers wanted was apples to ferment into booze. Yep. Johnny planted apples so people could get liquored up. But you try telling truths like that to first graders and the school board suddenly gets all up in arms about promoting drinking and handing out apple mash to kids and, oh my god, Mr. Don't _PM _me _breasts. You're drunk right now, aren't you? Not my fault that Billy couldn't hold his booze. And I'll be damned if I'm going to teach lies to kids just cause the man tells me I can't drink moonshine during planning period. Per accounts from Christopher Columbus' men, he would have the hands of indigenous children cut off, tied together and placed around their necks where they had to wear it as they rotted or be killed. This was not taught in school. Roman troops were provided cow intestines condoms, as STD epidemics could decide the fate of entire wars. You know when we say, "How's it going?" as a general phrase to inquire about a person's health. Well, that comes from the French, comment allez-vous, which was a phrase asked by doctors around the Renaissance period to inquire about how you are shitting. How are you going to the toilet, is what was meant, because at the time one of the ways to have precise information about someone's health was to have a look-see at his bowels. I find it funny that it has become this everyday phrase that is said all around the world. At the time, hearing someone answer, "not so well," could be that guy's last words. King Louis XIV had a labor fetish. He liked to watch his wife and his mistresses give birth. He got frustrated because the laboring chair obscured the view, so he started the whole flat on your back, legs in the air position. Canadians were very brutal towards the Germans during the First World War. They exploited the trust out of them by throwing cans of meat in their trenches. When the Germans asked for more, they threw hand grenades instead. They were also known for killing the wounded and surrendered Germans. One case had a Canadian soldier slipping a live grenade into a German POW, killing him. They also were the most enthusiastic users of poison gas on the Western Front. They pretty much gassed anything that moved, if they had the chance. Some estimates at 1.90% of the gas attacks were caused by Canadians. During night trench raids, Canadian would make their faces black, wore thick dark gloves and used meat cleaver, push daggers, trench clubs with nails embedded and other homemade weapons on the Germans. There was a Russian scientist by the name of Ilya Ivanov attempted to make a human/chimpanzee hybrid. He even went as far as secretly inseminating African women, but there were consequences and led to nothing. Freaking Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, man. A polyamorous Prussian, so flamingly, I mean unabashedly, flamingly, gay. He'd already been kicked out of the Prussian army, blackballed in Europe, and notoriously unwelcome in France. He was such a brilliant military brain that he was recruited by Ben Franklin to train our losing soldiers during the Revolutionary War. Von Steuben is not only one of the primary reasons we won our freedom, his teaching is still the basis of all our military's current training manuals. And when he showed up to Valley Forge, he brought with him not one, not two, but 3 lovers who also served as his aides de camp and translators. I'm paraphrasing here, because I learned this in similar post a few months back, and credit goes to you/flighting1881. Some days, I really fucking love Reddit. Nero the Roman emperor killed his wife. Found a slave boy that looked similar to his wife, castrated him, then made him his wife. In the 19th century, women were prescribed cocaine tampons to relieve pain from menstrual cramps. During World War I, soldiers would avoid going into the trenches by purposefully catching STIs to be discharged. They would even give them to each other to help each other out. Moats around fortifications and castles were absolutely filled with piss and shit. Normally the towers of the castles had holes that dropped the waste directly into the moat, and also moats did not always have drainage or flow. The worst part is that people would drink directly from the moats if they didn't have other options. That during the United States Civil War, the camps of soldiers were followed by camps of prostitutes. And let's just say that treating STDs got a lot more pleasant over the years. In the mid-1800s, large American cities had thousands of horses in them for transportation, but no street cleaning. Each horse could produce 22 pounds of manure per day. Needless to say, there were piles of horse manure all throughout cities that were feet high, and they just left it there to be washed away by the rain or eaten by hogs. Oh, and when the horses died, they just left the body where it fell. In 1672, Dutch people ate their prime minister.